In a world addicted to noise, self-glory, and constant opinion, what if the strongest thing you could do was stay silent? What if the most powerful version of you wasn't the one who won every argument, but the one who knelt when no one else did? Today, you'll discover how focusing on God, humbling your heart, and choosing silence can unlock a strength this world cannot understand. This message is not for the proud, it's for the quiet warriors, the unseen faithful, the ones who walk with purpose in the shadows. Let's begin. Step 1. True focus on God begins when self fades into the background. The soul cannot gaze fully upon God while obsessed with its own reflection. As long as self remains at the center, God will always appear peripheral, blurred, obscured, distant. This is the silent tragedy of much modern spirituality. A faith still rooted in the language of the self, draped in God's vocabulary. We speak of God's plan when we really mean our ambitions blessed by heaven. We pray not for communion, but for convenience. We want God close enough to comfort, but not so close that he might confront. But true focus, holy, undivided focus on God, requires that the self take its proper place, not erased, but dethroned. To focus on God is to enter a reordering of vision. It is to willingly loosen our grip on identity built by applause, accomplishments, and personal narrative. It is not that the self is evil, but it is incomplete when it lives apart from its creator. The heart cannot serve two masters, and attention split between the throne of God and the mirror of ego will eventually collapse under contradiction. For this reason, God calls not just for our worship, but our surrender. Not only our praises, but our posture. And the posture of focus is a bowed head, not a lifted chin. The fading of self is not a loss, but a liberation. The self, left to its own desires, is a demanding tyrant, always craving validation, always chasing more, always fearing it will not be enough. But when the self begins to recede, when it grows quiet, something sacred happens. We begin to see, really see. We see the face of God not as an idea or a religious category, but as the source from which every good and perfect thing flows. We see holiness not as a standard to attain, but a presence to behold. And in this beholding, everything else becomes less urgent. Lesser lights dim, competing voices grow quiet. The clamor of worldly pursuits is drowned by the gentle hush of divine nearness. But this fading is not automatic. It is a war, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, between two kingdoms, the kingdom of self and the kingdom of God. The self resists its own fading. It fights for the last word, the final opinion, the central role. It subtly injects itself into even the holiest of actions, twisting devotion into performance and worship into transaction. The danger is not always in obvious rebellion, but in disguised self-importance, dressed in religious language. This is why focusing on God is not a single act, but a lifelong discipline, a continual emptying, a daily turning of the eyes. To focus on God means we must no longer be obsessed with how we are perceived, how we compare, or how we control outcomes. It means surrendering our personal brand, our relentless striving, and our sacred independence. It means allowing His greatness to eclipse our self-importance. It means allowing the soul to be still long enough for heaven to come into view, not to impress, not to climb, not to be seen, but simply to adore. In the quiet chambers of the heart, where ego no longer shouts, the whisper of God begins to speak. Step 2. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Humility has long been misunderstood, misrepresented as weakness, passivity, or low self-esteem. Many associate humility with timidity, with walking through life as if apologizing for one's existence. But humility is not the denial of worth. It is the redirection of attention. It is not degrading oneself, but displacing the obsession with oneself. To be humble is not to believe you are unworthy, but to live as though your worth is settled, secure, and therefore no longer needs to be proven in every room you walk into. It is to become unburdened by the need to constantly assess how you are seen, how you compare, how you rank. The humble soul is not self-loathing, it is simply free. Pride, in contrast, is rarely loud, it often whispers. It shows up in subtle calculations, in the way we present ourselves, in the conversations we steer toward our achievements, in the quiet longing to be admired. Pride thrives in both success and insecurity, because both keep the self in focus. The person who boasts about their greatness and the person who constantly doubts their worth are not opposites. They are two forms of the same disease, a heart still centered on self. One cries, "Look how great I am." The other cries, "Tell me I'm enough." Humility silences both. The humble person walks into a room and doesn't need to be the smartest, most gifted, or most admired. Not because they think they're inferior, but because they're no longer obsessed with measuring. They're free to see others, to listen, to celebrate without comparison, to serve without hidden motives. True humility allows space for others to shine without feeling threatened. It doesn't shrink in the presence of greatness and doesn't swell in the presence of weakness. It simply remains grounded, rooted, at peace. To think of yourself less is not to forget yourself. It's to be preoccupied with something greater. It's to be so enraptured by God, so attuned to others, that self fades quietly into the background. The humble are not invisible. They're just not fixated on their own image. They are deeply aware of their need for grace, but not stuck in shame. They recognize their limitations without being paralyzed by them. They can admit when they're wrong, not because they enjoy being wrong, but because they are more committed to truth than to ego. They can defer without fear, encourage without flattery, and lead without arrogance, because they have learned the secret, that a soul anchored in God no longer has to prove anything. Humility is the soil where all other virtues grow. It is the atmosphere in which love breathes and wisdom blossoms. And yet, it's often formed not in public acts, but in private decisions, in unseen moments of silence when you choose not to retaliate, in small acts of kindness when no one will notice, in quiet prayers that seek God's will above your own. It is built not by thinking you are nothing, but by being consumed with the one who is everything. And when your eyes are fixed there, on that glory, self quietly steps aside without protest, and you are left not empty, but full of something far more eternal than your own image. Step 3. Silence is not the absence of words, but the presence of wisdom. Silence to the shallow eye appears as a void, an absence of noise, an empty pause between words. But to the discerning soul, silence is not hollow. It is rich, weighty, and deeply alive. True silence is not merely the lack of speech. It is the active presence of something deeper, more enduring than words. It is not emptiness, but containment, not avoidance, but discernment. To be silent in the right moment is not to shrink away from truth, but to embody it in its most distilled form. Silence, when held with reverence, is not a gap in communication, but the purest expression of it. There are countless words spoken every day that carry no weight: casual opinions, shallow arguments, rehearsed answers, borrowed phrases. In a world addicted to the sound of its own voice, silence feels uncomfortable, even threatening. We have been conditioned to believe that constant expression equals strength, that whoever speaks loudest wins, that silence equals weakness, confusion, or fear. But wisdom knows better. Wisdom is not always heard in the roar. Sometimes It arrives gently in the refusal to speak when words would only feed the flames of ego or escalate what was meant to be disarmed. There is a holiness in the restraint of silence that few have the courage to cultivate. Silence is a teacher, subtle but uncompromising. It invites us inward, where motives are examined and thoughts are laid bare. It exposes how quickly we speak to defend ourselves, to control others, to be admired, or simply to avoid discomfort. It is far easier to talk than to listen, easier to react than to reflect. But wisdom is born in the space between impulse and expression. Silence does not just hold back words, it sifts them. It examines them before they ever leave the mouth. It does not forbid speech, it sanctifies it. There is a deep wisdom in choosing silence over noise, especially when silence is laced with purpose. Consider the power of stillness when misunderstood, when accused unjustly, when provoked to anger. Anyone can retaliate, argue, or assert dominance. It takes no great depth to do so, but to remain silent, not in bitterness, but in calm trust, requires a strength most cannot fathom. It is the strength of someone who knows they are not defined by others' opinions. The strength of one who trusts that truth will defend itself in time. The one who walks with God knows that not every attack must be answered, not every challenge must be met with words, and not every moment demands a voice. Silence is also fertile ground for the divine. In stillness, we hear whispers we would otherwise miss. The world shouts, but God often whispers. And if our lives are filled with unending sound, we will miss His quiet calling. There is wisdom that does not come from books or teachers, but from the quiet encounters between a soul and its maker. Silence is the language of that encounter. It is the sacred space where truth can settle deep into the heart, where clarity arises not from debate, but from stillness. Step 4. Pride drowns the soul. Humility lifts it into the arms of God. Pride is a slow and silent flood. It does not rush in with fury, but rises gradually, soaking into thoughts, soaking into motives, until the soul is waterlogged with self. At first, it disguises itself as strength, as confidence, as competence. It wears the mask of independence and dresses itself in the language of ambition. But beneath its surface is a deep hunger, a desperate need to be seen, to be praised, to be central. And once this hunger takes hold, it begins its drowning work. Pride lifts the head high, but it submerges the heart beneath the weight of its own ego. It blinds while it inflates, numbs while it celebrates. It promises elevation, but quietly steals breath from the soul. There is a reason why pride is so dangerous. It disconnects. It severs the link between man and God, between man and truth. Pride does not deny the existence of God outright. It just forgets Him. Pride says, "I am enough," even when the soul is starving. It says, "I will make my own way," even while walking in circles. Pride isolates. It convinces us we must carry everything alone, win every argument, defend every insult. It makes vulnerability feel like failure and correction feel like attack. And in that lonely fortress of self-dependence, the soul begins to drown, not in failure but in the illusion of control. Humility, by contrast, does not lower the soul, it rescues it. It does not weigh us down, it sets us free. While pride builds walls, humility opens windows. It is the posture of surrender, not because we are defeated, but because we recognize we were never meant to be the hero of our own story. Humility lifts because it aligns. It places us back in the order of creation, not at the center, but held in the arms of the one who is. To be humble is not to despise oneself, but to delight in something higher. It is to know that we are not the source, but we are known by the source, not the answer, but heard by the one who holds them all. When humility enters the heart, the pressure to perform begins to fade. The weight to impress is lifted. The obsession with proving our worth is replaced with the quiet confidence of being loved, chosen, and held. Humility doesn't compete. It serves. It doesn't strive. It trusts. And in this trust, the soul finds what pride could never offer: rest. A resting soul is not passive. It is powerful in a way the world does not recognize. It can withstand storms, resist temptation, and endure criticism, because it is not standing on its own name. It is hidden in something far greater. Humility lifts because God draws near to it. There is a divine magnetism between the Most High and the lowly of heart. The proud may speak of God, but the humble dwell with Him. Pride builds towers that reach toward heaven. Humility builds altars that bring heaven down. The one tries to ascend on its own strength. The other is raised by the hands of grace. Step 5. Stillness and silence make space for divine instruction. The human soul was never designed to live in constant motion. The body may endure exhaustion, but the spirit collapses under unending noise. We fill our days with hurried tasks, crowded thoughts, and words that rush faster than meaning can form. Silence has become foreign. Stillness, nearly extinct. Yet it is in this forgotten territory, this sacred stillness and reverent quiet, that divine instruction begins to take root. God, who fashioned the universe with a word, still chooses to guide His people most clearly through the absence of many. Not in the storm, but in the whisper. Not through the crowd, but in the cave. Stillness is not merely pausing outward activity. It is quieting the war within. It is letting the noise of ambition, comparison, fear, and self-preservation settle like dust until the view becomes clear again. We spend our energy listening to everything except the voice that truly matters. Culture demands opinions. Circumstances demand reactions. But divine instruction is not shouted over chaos. It is spoken into peace. God waits for the soul to come away from the clamor. He does not compete with the world's volume. He speaks to those who willingly step back from it. The voice of the Spirit is not lost. It is just rarely heard by a heart that never stops speaking. Silence is not empty. It is expectant. It is the soil in which revelation can take root. When words cease and distractions fall away, something beautiful happens. Space opens within the soul. Space not filled by anxiety or entertainment, but by presence. God's presence does not crash into the soul. It fills what is surrendered. In the stillness, the soul becomes teachable again. It stops pretending to know everything. It lets go of its need to argue, to perform, to be right. And in that humility, the soul is finally ready to receive. There is divine wisdom that cannot be taught in noise. Some truths must be absorbed in silence, like seeds that germinate only in darkness. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the heart is stripped bare, instruction flows, not always in sentences, but in convictions, impressions, and holy clarity. Stillness becomes a classroom where the teacher writes on the soul with invisible ink. The lessons are not rushed, nor are they forced. They are given in divine time, through divine means, in divine gentleness. God does not merely speak to inform us, He speaks to transform us. And transformation does not happen in a hurry. It happens in stillness, the kind of stillness that listens not just with ears, but with surrender, a stillness that is not bored with silence, but in awe of what it holds. The voice that shaped galaxies does not need to raise itself to speak clearly. It simply waits for us to stop long enough to hear. And when we do, we find that the instruction we longed for was not far. It was simply waiting behind the noise, ready to shape the soul in ways words alone never could. Step 6. Those who walk with God don't need to shout, they shine. There is a quiet authority in those who walk closely with God, an unshakable steadiness that doesn't need to prove itself. They move through the world not seeking applause, not craving spotlight, not chasing attention. They do not need to shout, argue, or insist on being heard, because something deeper radiates from within them. Theirs is a light not manufactured by charisma or platform, but born from intimacy with the divine. The glow that surrounds such a person is not loud, not showy, but it is unmistakable. It is the kind of presence that shifts a room without a word, the kind of influence that cannot be explained, only experienced. The world is filled with noise, voices fighting for space, opinions rising like waves in a storm. In this sea of self-expression, shouting becomes a strategy for survival. The louder, the more visible. The bolder, the more powerful. But those who walk with God are not threatened by silence or obscurity. They are not anxious to prove their significance. They have tasted something greater than recognition. They have been in the presence of the One who sees all. And once you have stood before the Almighty, the need to be seen by men loses its grip. You no longer shout to be known. You shine because you are known. Shouting seeks to convince others of one's strength. Shining reveals a strength that needs no explanation. It's not the energy of self-promotion, but the quiet fire of God's presence dwelling within. There is a deep trust in those who shine. They trust that righteousness will speak for itself, that light exposes darkness. Without needing to condemn it, that truth does not need to compete with lies, only to stand unshaken. Their confidence is not volume, but clarity. They carry peace in chaos, patience in pressure, gentleness in provocation. And in doing so, they reflect the nature of the One they walk with. The shining of the soul is not a performance, it is a result. It flows from the inner chambers of communion, from time spent in prayer, in worship, in surrender. It is cultivated in unseen hours when the heart bends low before God. These are not people who avoid conflict, but they do not enter it recklessly. They are not passive, but they are deeply restrained, guided by something greater than impulse. Their light is not a flicker of emotion, but a steady flame, fed by grace, not ego. Their lives become a testimony more powerful than arguments, their joy a rebuke to despair, their consistency a witness to truth in a world driven by change. They are not interested in sounding right, they are interested in being right with God. And in that rightness, they shine, not with the brilliance of the world's stage lights, but with the enduring radiance of heaven's glow. They do not force themselves into conversations. They are invited, not because of their volume, but because of their vision, not because they insist, but because they inspire. As we draw near the close of this reflection, remember this. In a world filled with noise, pride, and fleeting acclaim, it's the quiet soul, anchored in humility and focus, who draws closest to the heart of God. You don't need to compete. You don't need to justify. You don't need to shout. Simply keep walking in quiet devotion. Let your life reflect His light, and trust that the ripples of obedience will reach farther than the loudest voice ever could. May your spirit be marked not by how loudly you speak, but by how brightly you shine. Your steps don't need to be the most visible, as long as they are the most faithful. In the silence of surrender, in the stillness of trust, and in the humility of heart, may you discover a presence that lifts you higher, speaks more clearly, and endures more deeply than any praise of men. Walk on softly, shine on steadily, and let God's light radiate through a life surrendered, not for applause, but for His glory.